Hello, everyone. My name is Meg from Brighton Students' Union, and today I'm going to be talking with the wonderful Dr. Caroline West. We've spoken before, we did a podcast back in February, but we're speaking again because we're doing some more consent workshops at Brighton Students' Union in May, and everyone can, attend, and it's going to be absolutely brilliant. And I just wanted to chat to you again, Caroline, because I feel like so much has happened since we last spoke. But if you don't mind, I know you've done this before, but do you mind introducing yourself again, about who you are, your experience, your interest in all things sex and consent and relationships? That would be amazing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild one because I'm kind of all over the place. So I'm a sex columnist. I have a podcast called Glow West, which looks at sex and sexuality. I'm the sex and relationship expert for Bumble Ireland. I write about sex in the media. I'm a sexpert on TV over here on a show called The Elaine Show. And I have my PhD and MA in sexuality studies and will shortly be a certified sex and relationship coach and a certified master sexpert. So all kind of over the place with that. And then outside of that, I've worked about 22 years in social care, the last 7 of which have been supporting women who've been the victim of domestic violence. And so on top of all that as well, I'm also a trained consent facilitator. I'm currently taking another module on sexual consent promotion. And outside of all that as well, I have personal life and, experience of all sorts of relationships from negative to positive as well. So all of that combines into how I teach the consent workshops. And yeah, it's kind of I get around. I think is the short answer to all of that. So it's really fun
Yeah.
to combine all of those things together, though.
Mm, it's brilliant, the stuff you do.
Thank you. No, it's just, it's nice to create a space where we can just have calm, informed chats about sex because it affects so much of us. And, we don't have great sex education in schools, generally speaking, or, society sometimes doesn't give us the best idea of what sex is. And then you're trying to figure out what your identity is and all this kind of stuff. So it's nice to be able to talk to people who want to
Yeah.
offer their knowledge and create a nice, calm space. And that's also kind of fun as well. So, because, sex is weird and wonderful and funny and ridiculous. So, why not put a bit of fun into it too?
But yeah, so on the topic of consent, that's what Brighton SU are focusing on, because we want to teach students and staff this time all about the importance of consent and just what it is, the myths around it, that kind of thing. And you specialise in consent, that topic. And could you just remind people, I know you spoke about this again in the last podcast, but it'd be great if you could remind people why you are so passionate about consent and your experience
Sure.
with it.
Yeah. I think it's just so important because it's obviously at the heart of every sexual encounter, but yet we don't seem to have the skills to really address what consent is and what consent means to us. And, it's like the analogy I always use is like it's like driving a car. You don't just sit in it and know how to drive a car. So you have to learn. And it's the same with sex. Nobody is born knowing how to have sex or to communicate about sex. So we have to learn these things. And I think the more we normalize things like consent, conversations and things like that, just the more normal it is to bring that into your sex life also. And I think sometimes there's very simplistic slogans like yes means yes and no means no. And it's like, okay, obviously that's true, but that's too simplistic for like diving into like the nuances of consent and things like sexual coercion when someone might actually give a yes and what they really mean is no, but it's not safe for them to give a no, things like that. So, and I think it's important to understand that consent can be really sexy as well. And each time like you're communicating about sex, that is consent as well. So it's not this big, massive, awkward thing. It doesn't have to be like that. But I think it's really important. If I had a few people reach out after the last couple of classes I did, and they'd said, oh, I never thought about consent that way. And actually, that I'm now able to name some of the stuff that happened to me, and I can actually maybe seek support for that. And I think that's really powerful because I think consent violations are unfortunately really, really common. And like I said last time, they've happened to me as well. So I bring in my personal experience of that, because some people are like, oh, you must have your act together, you're a sex educator, and I'm like, I did not. For the longest time I absolutely did not have my act together. And so bringing in that, I suppose, helps people understand that sexual violence is a spectrum, and we have to know what we are consenting to and what we are not consenting to. So bringing in that, and then talking about consent outside of workshops and things like that, I think it's really important to, tackle topics like victim blaming and stuff like that, because that misunderstands what consent is. If we're constantly going, why didn't you fight back, and why didn't you scream, and all this kind of stuff, like that's, not understanding the nature of sexual violence, things like that. So I just think the more we talk about these things, the more chance we have of building a happier society, and one where we can have all the types of weird and wonderful sex that we want to, as long as it is consensual. So we empower people once we give them the tools to empower themselves. So it should be simple, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, honestly, these workshops are brilliant. So for anyone listening or watching, I would really encourage you to come along, because they are amazing and they cover topics that you wouldn't even think about, like myths and culture and stuff like that. And it's just so interesting. So what have you been up to, Caroline, since we last spoke? As I said, we spoke in February. What have you been doing since?
Been all over the place. I taught 27 workshops in February. So that was like, my poor voice was just gone by the end of the month. And that was teaching workshops on like things like healthy relationships, consent, masturbation, image-based sexual abuse. So I have a good few more coming up, but it's really fun. This is the joy of Zoom, that I can sit in my kitchen and teach. It's kind of handy, and I don't have to deal with a flight or anything like that. And yeah, I've just been writing a fair bit. I'm hoping to have a piece published actually on how we talk about consent in society, in a newspaper coming out soon. So that can kind of add to the things. But yeah, I think March I spent recovering from February and working so hard. So that's not a bad thing. But yeah, and I've also started organizing panels that are open to everyone. So I have International Women's Day. I hosted a panel with a diverse group of women. And April 27th, I have another panel coming up about sex in Ireland, which might not be as relevant to the UK, but you'll still learn a thing or two. So yeah, I'm going to be doing those every 2 months, because again, I'm all about like making knowledge accessible to everybody. That's how we learn. So it's free, and you can win some goodies from Hanks and stuff as well. So that's kind of nice. So yeah, I've been busy and finishing up a chapter on zombie porn, which was quite an experience. I suppose I didn't think I'd be writing about
Wow.
that, but yeah, interesting times.
Where do you write about
This is
that?
for a book that's coming out, I think, later this year. It's an edited collection on zombie theories. And while most of the normal people are writing about zombies and video games and stuff, of course, being a sexuality educator, I had to write about zombie porn and what that teaches us about bodies and pleasure and consent and all these kind of things. So
Wow.
it's a little bit unusual, but it's fun too.
It's interesting. That's so interesting. That sounds amazing. Sound like you've been doing some really great things. We're just so happy to have you back. I
Oh,
didn't know if we'd be
yay.
able to, because
No, the
obviously
more the
people,
merrier. I'm
want
always
you to come
happy to
in.
chat about consent. So yeah, happy days.
Yeah, incredible. So the tragic event of Sarah Everard happened, how long ago was it now? A few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And that was absolutely devastating. And it happens, so often. It's happened since then. People are going missing all the time, especially women. And obviously it's now 2021, and you'd think that this wouldn't be happening anymore.
Specifically in England, I think the statistics are something like a woman's murdered by her partner every couple of days, I think. I think it's like a really, really high number, or maybe like one or two a week, something extremely high. But I think what also ignited it was the conversations around it of there are some people saying, well, she shouldn't have been walking home at that time of night, and so which is essentially blaming her for being murdered. And then some people saying, oh, she did everything right. She walked on street lights. She walked at a reasonable time. And like, that's also victim blaming in itself, because I should be able to stumble home a drunk, sloppy mess at
Mm,
2 a.m. in complete pitch
hmm.
darkness, like thrown up on the way and
Yeah.
everything else. And I should make it home alive and and safe, so I think that we have a
Yeah.
lot to learn about what we say of, oh, she did everything right. And
Yeah. That's
yeah,
so true. I didn't think
because
about
there's no
that.
such thing as like a perfect victim, when we kind of look for this sometimes, and
Yeah.
it's like, no, that's just not the case. And I think it just, especially with Sarah's case, it just really showed like that lack of trust we can have in authority figures. And because obviously there's a police officer arrested, or possibly questioned. I'm not sure if they've been charged for her murder. But yeah, it's just a shock of, that feeling of who can we actually trust? And I think
Mm,
that's really, you, you know, it's absolutely a valid concern for sure. I would like us to get to a point where we change culture rather than relying on legal systems and,
yeah.
these kind of authority structures. Like if we change the culture where we think we don't murder people and we don't
Yeah.
violate consent all the time. And that's where I kind of go with the workshops. I look at how we can change our society as well. And we can all do it. We can all contribute a tiny little piece um, to this. And I think the more we change culture, the more stuff like this would hopefully decrease. But I just think,
Mm,
yeah, it was just such a shocking case. But then brought to light things like racism. And because I saw on social media that there were a couple of Black women that had been murdered, and
mhm.
possibly like pictures of their bodies being shared by the police force. So, but that
Yeah.
obviously hadn't made waves because they were Black women. And that's obviously, we need to look at this through those angles of racism and classism and,
Yeah.
the intersectional kind of approach as well. So I think, yeah, there's a long way to go. And I think hopefully there's more of a hunger for changing things and looking at how we can change things, because we've all said problematic statements. We've all said, oh God, were they drinking or whatever, because that's the society we grow up in. It's not,
Mm,
that's normal that we would repeat the stuff we've heard without even kind of thinking about it. But now, it's 2021, it's time for a change, and we don't have to tolerate the same society that we've grown up in. We can change things. And even if it's just you and doing one little piece, that still changes everything for a lot of people.
mm. Like you said, there's two sides to it. There's the, putting up more CCTV cameras, and, um, a student came to me with an idea of having a night bus just for students, that kind of thing. There's also the other side of it, which is, like you said, changing the culture. Um, and I think both are important. Unfortunately, you want it to just be the culture one, because that, it should be people changing. But then obviously people want to feel, more protected. But yeah, it's a really difficult one.
Yeah, because you have to do something immediately, and culture change
Yeah.
takes a long time. So I definitely understand that aspect of things. And
Mm,
yeah, it's a hard one because you're talking long term here. It's not a knee jerk reaction and then everything goes quiet again. It's like these are all things that we can use to change the world on, and it shouldn't have to be the case that it takes somebody being murdered to do so. But
mhm.
mm, hopefully we start moving into a better society where things like misogyny and racism are just the abnormal side of things, not the norm, which
Yeah.
unfortunately is the case at the moment.
Hmm. Another question I was going to ask was, how do you think men can be good allies? Because I think a lot of men are struggling and they don't know what to do. There's some that for a matter of fact aren't interested, others
Mhm.
who do want to do something but they don't know what to do. And I feel like a lot of the time they don't want to be involved in the conversation because they're scared of saying the wrong thing.
I always start the workshops by reminding everyone that everyone can be a victim and everyone can be a perpetrator. I do think obviously we have to recognize that a lot of the people who perpetrate these kind of assaults and abuses are men. So we do need to look at that and look at like what if we're guys, what our friends are saying to us, things like this. So looking at things like understanding what rape culture is, like educate yourself on that rather than immediately going, this is an attack on me, because it's not an attack on me. It's men as a concept. It's like when we say, oh, all men are trash, whatever. It's not, it doesn't mean
Yeah.
actual men. It means like the violent, horrible men that are doing this kind of stuff. And the analogy for that is, if I gave you a packet of Skittles and one was poisoned, would you eat the rest, or would you know to trust the rest? Well, no, because some of them are dangerous. So that's the real problems. This way we need men to step up and say, hey, what can I do? And some of it is just listening to women and
Mm,
understanding, oh, okay, that's actually how my friend feels, or my sister feels, or a random strange woman that I'm not related to. And learning about it, and taking that time. I mean, the rest of us have to learn it and, work through things. So I think it's important. I think toxic shame kind of comes into that a little bit of like, you know, it's scary for a lot of men to confront what they've been taught about sexual assault and what they've been taught about women, misogyny,
mhm,
and things like this. And it's kind of like the same way with sex. You're not born knowing how to automatically break down all these rape myths and the misogyny in society, especially as a guy, when you've been groomed to kind of be part of that system. So
mhm.
this is a chance for like education and going, okay, I would like to not be part of that culture. How can I
Yeah.
start? So that's educating yourself, like listen to women, listen to podcasts, read some books. There's amazing books on consent out there nowadays. One called Ask by Kitty Stryker. There's tons, absolute tons, and they're like, €10 or, £8 or whatever it is. And so it's easy accessible, and there's also websites. If you don't have any money, there's websites, there's podcasts, there's talks, all that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So taking that step to educate yourself is really important, and not expecting a pat on the back for doing it as well. This is just what decent
Yeah.
humans do. You don't have to get a cookie or a star or anything for being a good man. I think that's what's really frustrating for a lot of women. Um, and especially though a lot of men who are like keen to show you that they know better, and that's fine, that's a good thing, but just do it rather than going, look, I need attention because I did this like consent workshop or something. Just do it and move on with your life and make a better world as you go, without, because a lot of women are tired of doing all this work all the time. So you don't have to do the emotional labor of going, well done you, that was great, just do it and move on, and create that change. So I think there's so much space. I would love to have, campaigns from men talking to other men about consent and misogyny and things like this. And I would love to see that happening. And there are groups online and on Twitter and in the UK, and that are men teaching men how to look at consent. I know I'm on my podcast, I interviewed Richard M. Wright, and he is a man in the US and he teaches other men about consent. And I really like
Yeah.
that because that's a space that men can kind of engage with as well and not feel as scared or something like that. So I think, looking up the work of him, or again, listening to that podcast episode, I forget the number of it, but I'll put it in the workshops and things like that. But
Yeah.
like there are resources out there. So it is time for people to do the work.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Something as well I was thinking about was I feel like members of the LGBTQ community are not spoken about enough when it comes to the conversations around sexual assault, abuse,
Yeah.
harassment. So, a question I wanted to ask you was how do you think cisgender people, I know some people might know what cisgender means. So, for anyone who doesn't know, it's basically it's when someone's gender identity matches the sex they were assigned with at birth. But I just wanted to ask, how do you think cisgender people can be allies for the LGBTQ community? Because I feel like a lot of the time people are very selective with their activism,
Mm.
and they'll be activists for a certain group but not others.
Yeah.
And I find that really problematic.
Yeah,
But how,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. And groups like trans people are a higher risk of violence for, if in a lot of different countries as well. So I actually think like Active Consent are a really great Irish company, and they've got amazing graphics and stuff on their Instagram, things like that. And they found in their research that actually non-binary people experience more sexual assault than cis people. So I think that, well, not cis people, straight people, sorry. Um,
mm,
so I thought that was an interesting statistic. So again, it's the same as, what men need to do. It's just learning about it and like
yeah,
reading about why trans people are so, subjected to such violence, and then calling that out and challenging it. And I know at the moment the UK media has massive transphobia. What's the word? There's lots of transphobia in the media, forgot my words.
mhm,
And it's about calling that out when you see it, or if you hear people in your friend group making like transphobic statements or something, calling that out, because that change starts at those levels. Like if we're making society not welcoming to people that are
Yeah.
LGBTQ, then what hope do they have of like feeling like they're going to be believed or that they're safe if we can't even refer to them in the correct terms, or we're misgendering them, or we're dead naming them, things like this. So there's so many levels you can do that. But again, if you're talking about how to be a good ally, again, listening to trans people or LGBTQI people and saying, what do you need? What can we do? And then looking and not making your trans friend your source of education because they have enough labor to be doing to just get through the day, but going
Yeah.
to some of the organizations like Stonewall have really great information on their site, or any kind of LGBT support service will have great information of like, here's how you can be an ally and here's what you
Yeah.
can do. And for some of us who feel like, oh, that's too much, it's not really. You can do little things, like I said, like, using the correct pronouns, or remembering that the world isn't just a binary of men and women, and that there's lots of different genders and sexualities out there. And just making that part of our everyday talk is, that's one step to making a more inclusive society. So you can do little things and you can do big things. It depends on what your level is, but all that information is definitely out there. So
Yeah.
and it's all, thankfully most of us have smartphones now, so we can all look it up on our phones within 5 seconds. So it's nice and accessible.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the power of social media, obviously the
Yeah.
social media can be negative at times for different reasons, but it
Mm,
can also be great in terms of education. I feel like so many
absolutely.
teenagers now probably learn so much from like
Yeah.
Instagram than
There's so many
school.
great accounts out there that are giving
Yeah,
this information away for free, and it's like, and really like
clear.
graphics and everything, and it's like, wow,
Yeah,
your play. So yeah,
it's
and
really
TikTok,
easy.
things like that. It's like,
Yeah,
that makes me feel really old, but like there's great TikTok stuff going on out there. So yeah, we're getting there.
oh, definitely. I think that's a really good idea to find some Instagram accounts, like you said, like Stonewall,
Mm,
and some TikTokers, and I'll make sure they're linked below on this video because,
that would be
you
fab.
know, but so I found out recently that as of March 2021, it was decided in England and Wales that misogyny will now be recorded as a hate crime. I thought it was already a hate crime. I was so surprised that it wasn't already. And that's brilliant. We're making progress. But in England and Wales, why do you think it's taken so long for this to happen? I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but
Yeah.
I'd love to know that. I'll ask you that in a second, actually, what it's like in Ireland.
Yeah,
But
well,
why do
we
you think it's taken so long?
I think it's just hasn't been viewed as important as a lot of stuff to do with women has not been viewed as important, really, or maybe the assumption is other laws can take care of it. But you know,
Yeah,
if you're dealing with an assault on someone, that's one thing, and some laws will deal with that. But if it's motivated by the color of that person's skin, it's also a hate crime because they're not
mhm,
just being assaulted because they were happened to be randomly walking by. They're assaulted because they were a black person, or
yeah,
whatever it happens to be. Um, so that does have an extra element to it. And I think there's the misogyny element. For some people, they seem to insist that we don't live in a misogynistic society, and we don't live in a rape culture, and victim blaming isn't a big deal. And it's like, it absolutely is a massive deal because it feeds into all the assaults and making those assaults
hmm,
acceptable in our society, things like that. So I think there has been a real unwillingness to listen to victims. And I think the shocking statistics, I think it's something like 96 or 97% of sexual offences in the UK go unpunished, and they don't result in guilty verdicts, things like this. And like, don't quote me definitely on that, but I think it's like a ridiculously high number like that. So it's
yeah,
like it's almost like an unpunishable crime. Like, so
mm,
that's something that we need to look at and go, what's going on there? Like, if this was anything else, that we kind of look at this, but it's just not, just hasn't been given its place. And I think
mm,
this is why we need to have governments that are more diverse, and not just in
yeah,
terms of gender, but in ethnicity and race and age and class and ability, like things like that. I
hmm,
think maybe historically, white government that's full of able-bodied men mightn't consider, hey, disabled people of color are at super high risk of sexual assault,
Mm,
because that's not their lived experience. So they mightn't think
yeah.
about that as much. So, but again, if we allow those people to take part in government decision making and advocacy groups and made it an accessible place, I think those stories come out more then. And also some people just don't want to deal with it because it's such a massive thing. It's everywhere in our society that it's too much for some people to deal with. It's too overwhelming for some people to deal with. So it's a mess basically. But look, at least it's there now finally. But yeah, Ireland doesn't have hate crime legislation. That's a thing that they're thinking about bringing in. I'm not sure if misogyny is part of it. It's more at more looking at racism at the moment, which is on the rise in Ireland at the
Hmm.
moment. But there's pushback on it as well, to think, it's not the solution. Again, cultural change is more the answer, so to speak. But again, it's like you said earlier, it's that battle between what do we do right now and what do we
Yeah.
do long term. And it's not an easy one, unfortunately, to
Yeah.
answer. But yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to education. But again, that takes time as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
What are the other laws like in Ireland? Are there any laws surrounding gender or that kind of
Yeah,
thing?
well, we have our equal, what is it, equal rights, and discrimination, stuff like that. I don't know
Hmm.
whether how effective they are in real life, but we have a really good system for trans people with the Gender Recognition Act, that they can self ID as trans people. And it's not like you guys, I think, tried to bring that in a little bit more, and there's a lot of pushback on it.
Hmm.
That passed over here with literally no issues,
Oh,
and
wow.
it makes the life of trans people a lot easier. Now, it's not ideal because it doesn't deal with trans people, I think, under either 16 or 18, and it doesn't deal with non-binary people or intersex people, or that kind of aspect of things. But and intersex people have to pick a gender to be recognized in Irish law. You have to tick a box that you are either male or female or trans, so you can't tick intersex, on those kind of boxes. So
Mm.
um it's not a great thing. And that's again, I talked about that on the podcast. Under Irish law, have to be one or the other, so there's a long way to go to kind of catch up on that aspect of things. But we
Yeah.
are slowly getting there. Slowly. It's kind of, I think some of the UK transphobia is trying to be imported over here at the moment. And there's quite a good pushback against that, so that's kind of good that way. But
Mm.
yeah, long way to go, but we'll get there. We will get there.
Yeah. It feels like everything's just takes so much time.
It does. It does. Well, on the plus side of things, consent classes are only new-ish here. They're not even a decade old. I think maybe 6, 7, 8 years. And there's huge backlash when that they first came in. Absolutely huge. There was like people writing newspapers saying how disgraceful it was, and people know what consent is, and you're just going to go in there and say all men are rapists, and like horrific backlash against
Mm.
everything. And now completely normalized, running in all third level institutions, now going into second level institutions. There's now plays about consent. There's much different atmosphere out there.
Yeah.
And it just feels really, in such a short space of time, like not even a decade, we've had a cultural change around consent. And we're recognizing now there's so much more to go. But for a
Yeah.
country that historically like tried to stuff sex down, and like, we do not talk about sex in this country, to now have consent classes running and like being totally accepted and normalized, I think it's huge, and in a very short space of time. So I kind of cling on to that whenever I get depressed about like all the work we have to do, and
Yeah.
recognize that like actually there's, it is really good. There's a lot of changes on the way. So
Ah,
thankfully.
yeah, I think that's good. That's a good way of looking at it and staying positive, because if you get too negative,
Yeah.
sometimes it, I don't know, affects.
Absolutely. And
Um,
you might think, oh, there's so much work to do. What can I do as one person? And there's
mm,
so much you can do. Like I said earlier, like not misgendering people. That's a huge
yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
or calling out, somebody for their misogynistic statement. That's
Mm,
not like changing the world single-handedly, but it's showing to the people around you that, oh, that person kind of gets it.
Mhm.
and that person is making the world a little bit safer. So we do talk about that aspect, excuse me, in some of the workshops about what you could do as one person, and
Yeah,
some of the people who've done it before in February, like one of them went on to write an article about consent. One of them's
oh,
running an event with their society, and it's like,
yeah,
yes, you listened in the workshop. This is what,
yeah,
this is how we change things. So I was delighted to see
yeah.
that. So fair play to
It's
them.
amazing because we only opened it up to societies last time,
Mm,
but this time we're opening it up to all students.
brilliant.
Because I've
Yeah.
had so many students saying, I didn't hear about these workshops. So, what do you think universities and all around the country can do, and around the world can do, to make
Yeah.
students feel safer, especially after what happened with Sarah Everard? I know that a lot of students, and myself even, have just become a bit more scared going outside because
Yeah.
you
You
don't
know,
know.
it is absolutely hard, and the scary thing about that is as well is that a lot of women are actually safer outside because a lot of the violence happens indoors at home at the
Yeah.
hands of partners more so than strangers.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's rarer, not to make people even more freaked out, but I think, recognizing that a lot of the students on campus will have experiences of sexual assault, of domestic violence, of random acts of violence committed against them. So it means them stepping up and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. Here's our statement of what we are actually going to do. Not making a statement going, oh, that was terrible, and then leaving it at that. Like action needs to come in here. And whether
Yeah.
that's, increasing funding for consent workshops, for domestic violence awareness weeks, things like this, or
Yeah.
um, just like healthy relationship awareness week, things like that. If it comes to it, like even practical things, as in like putting more lights on the campus, if that's what makes people feel a bit safer, like you said earlier,
Hmm.
like maybe putting on a night bus just for students, things like that. But I think running out training for like disclosure training for staff of, again, the active consent stats were that most students won't disclose to staff, and it's like, okay, there's something in that, like why are staff not seeing as a good source? So training staff to deal with this, and training staff to deal with, their biases around consent and rape myths and things like this as well.
Yeah.
And then, some people would argue for consent classes to be made mandatory. I don't know about that, because I'd like people to like want to go rather than like,
Yeah.
oh, I have to go. But I'd
Yeah.
like, like maybe the first week or something of college, it's like offered to everybody, like things like consent workshops. In University College Cork, they have a bystander program that's really, really good, and that has like, looks at things like consent and rape myths and things like this. And I think, I'm not sure how long it goes on for, maybe a month or two or something. And at the end, a lot of students have said, actually, I really kind of understand this a lot more now, and it's had really positive impact. So if things like that were rolled out, um, universally, that would be great as well. But I'm also a massive fan of things like art campaigns, and like putting physical spaces on campus where, you have like, a photo exhibition of like what consent is, or,
Hmm.
in one case, DCU, a university I used to work for, had an anti-harassment wall, and they got students to put up posters on a wall outside, and it was like, filled with slogans about sexual harassment, like "it stops now" and things like this.
Hmm.
And that was just a nice reminder of people walking past that, like, this should not be tolerated on campus. So I think there's lots of ways, and so using art, using like actual programs being put in place, having awareness weeks, things like this. There's loads to be done, and that's the thing. It's like they can do nothing, or they can choose to make their space a safe space for literally thousands of students. And it's like those
Yeah.
thousands of students have experienced this, regardless of age or background or anything like that. So it's recognizing, okay, this is what's going on, putting those forward. And I think like welfare officers and student unions and things like that can definitely play a role in either rolling out events or lobbying the college to bring in, proper programs and things like that for like that go on for a month or two or something like that. So I think the
Yeah.
time is now. It's
Yeah.
definitely, and if they don't know where to start, there's universities around the world that will happily collaborate and be like, hey, this is what we're doing. It's this isn't, it doesn't have to be ignored, and ignoring it in this stage in 2021, is a choice, and it's the wrong choice to make.
Yeah, that's such a powerful statement you made about just saying, you know, we're sorry about this, or it's so bad that this happened, and if you need support, then it's good, obviously, offering support, but like you said, acting on it and making change, is the only way things can change, especially from big
Absolutely.
institutions. So definitely. So one question I wanted to ask you was, for anyone listening, for everyone listening right now to this podcast, please can you explain why education around this is so important? Because I feel like we talk about it, but a lot of people just, they say, oh yeah, it is important, but they don't understand how important it actually is. So why is raising awareness and educating people on this issue so incredibly important?
Absolutely. It's the way to change the world. No pressure there, but it is. And
Yeah.
the stuff that I've talked about and been open about is that, when I was growing up, my understanding of sexual violence was so limited because all I ever heard was that it was, like, say, violent penetration of a woman by a man and things like that. So that when other forms of sexual violence happened to
Yeah.
me, I didn't understand that
Mhm.
was sexual violence, and I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have any words for it. And
Mhm.
and then I couldn't heal from it because I couldn't name it as sexual violence. And I think
Yeah.
once I figured that out, I could start that healing process. And I think, there's a lot of people who would have that experience of going, I know something happened, but is it sexual assault? And is it serious? Oh, well, other people had violent experiences, so mine isn't the same as that. We kind of tend to minimize things a little bit. But I think that once we're empowered to know, actually, that was an experience of sexual violence, I think that empowers people and it helps them understand what happened to them. They can own it and then kind of move on. And then when we're talking, and even amongst our friends and stuff, if they're saying, oh, revenge porn, it's just a laugh, you can actually say, no, that's actually part of sexual violence, and
Mhm.
understand, what's going on there. So I think that's really important. But I think I talk a lot about changing um, the culture from a rape culture to a consent culture, and a lot of people in the workshop said that they hadn't heard that term before. So I think
Mhm.
that's really important to talk to people about, and because it gives us hope that we can change things. Like, all these
Yeah.
things we're talking about today are really depressing, and it's really overwhelming, and it's like, God, like, what do we do? What can we do? And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are really good hearted and they do want to change things, and they do, but they might know where to start or what language to use, or,
Mhm.
where to kind of go with things. So that's, the workshop gives people practical advice of, like, here's what you can do as an individual. Here's what you can do as part of a society. Here's what you can do as part of, like, nagging your student union to run classes or whatever, or lobbying your college to do things, or your church or your youth group or whatever happens to be. So there's
Mhm.
lots of different ways that people can take part, because this conversation comes from everywhere. It comes from all genders, all sexualities, institutions, social
Yeah.
media, all those kind of things. Like, we reach people where they are. And if the only thing you're capable of is, like, lying in bed scrolling through Instagram accounts that talk about this, that's still brilliant. That's still,
Mhm.
ways to go. And not everyone is going to be able to lobby their TD or their what do you guys call them, MPs, because that takes a lot of work, and maybe, you don't have the health for it or something like that, but maybe you can share an Instagram post, things like that. So I think that's really important to hopefully people come out of the workshops feeling a bit more empowered about what they can do to change things and to support people, and maybe just have a little bit more empathy for both for themselves, because I think we can beat ourselves up for, like, not knowing, or like, God, I said bad things before, or I made
Mhm.
jokes of this before, and it's like, that's okay. Look, again, we're all products of our society. The thing is,
Yeah.
like, not doing that going forward. So hopefully people come out feeling empowered and ready to get stuck in, hopefully. And even if you're not, at least it might plant some seeds in your head for things
Yeah.
going forward.
Yeah. Definitely. Oh, thank you so much, Caroline. This has been amazing. I love chatting to you.
Hey,
about all
me
things
too.
like
You ask
this.
such good questions.
Oh, no, but I really do. I know you say it is depressing, but it needs to be spoken about.
Yeah.
These conversations need to be had, and it's wonderful having conversation like this with someone like you who knows so much about it. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think it'd be really cool if you just told us what your social media handles are, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, even your podcast, which is incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the same on both Twitter and Instagram. It's at Glow West Podcast, all one word with two W's, one Glow West Podcast. And the podcast is obviously has the same title, Glow West Podcast. There's quite a few episodes on consent
Yeah.
on there. So, if you want to listen to them, I think there's 3 at the moment. And I will have a panel on consent in, I think, June. And that's going to be with experts in consent from all around the world talking about what we can do and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
So please do come along to that whenever that's announced. But yeah, I do put up on Instagram again information about consent and sex and things like that, as much as Instagram allows me to anyway, before I get kicked off for posting about sex online. But yeah, and again, people can reach out, and if I can't give you the answers to something, I can point you in the direction of someone that can. So I'm always happy to chat.
And I love how diverse you are in terms of different topics you talk about. You don't just stick to one topic. On your podcast, you talk about all kinds of things: sex, relationships, reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, and loads of different things. So I would really recommend listening.
Nice to get to chat to people from all over the world and from all different diverse backgrounds and things, because we all approach these topics so differently. So it's nice to just keep learning, I suppose, about it all. So
thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too.